welcome Caleb, welcome Nick. They're both British, but they are different kinds of scientists.
Well, nobody's perfect.
Exactly. We're going to try to start this discussion, I think, with the bigger picture. So we're going to take a look at this digital atlas. And one more time, so the movie starts. If you could forward it again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is a film made by the American Museum of Natural History and in collaboration with the Rubin Museum, and it's not a cartoon. Everything you see in this film, it has been mapped by some observation. So it's an atlas, it's a digital map of everything we know about the universe. Literally every observation that they could include, they included. These are just some of the human-made satellites that orbit the Earth. It was spectacular to me how many there are. But while we talk about this question, are we alone? I thought it would be interesting just to sort of reflect on the scale of things. And Caleb and Nick, you should not feel shy about chiming in if you want to. Where are we now? We're coming out pretty soon. We're going to see the orbit of the moon. If you think about where we've gone in the universe, we've been to the moon. I mean, that's amazing. It's not to be slighted. But that's it, right? There are the orbits of the other planets. We've never gone to Mars, obviously, although there's a big ambition to get to Mars, and this is one of the big questions. Is it worth going all the way to Mars? And this is our entire solar system. Our best satellites have only just broken out of the solar system. So Voyager, just a couple years ago, moved outside of the sun's influence and is technically interstellar. Those of you who are into astrology, shame on you. And also notice that as we pull away, these stars are actually nowhere near each other in three-dimensional space. They look near each other, projected on a flat map. Oh, that's important for our conversation. That's the distance of our first signals sent out into space. Notice it's gone nowhere outside of our neighborhood, basically, 70 light years. That's our entire galaxy, 100 billion stars, maybe a couple 100 billion stars. Now we're panning away from our galaxy and we're seeing all the galaxies nearby and all the galaxies that have ever been observed, at least to date when this atlas was made. These are entire huge structures of clusters of galaxies. The blank spaces aren't really blank. They're just regions we can't see through yet because there's dust or obstruction, but they're full, presumably. And so there are as many galaxies in the universe as there are stars in the Milky Way, which is pretty spectacular. And then we go back to about 14 billion light years distance, which is the light left over from the Big Bang, and that's the last thing we can see. Doesn't mean it's the last thing that's there, okay? You shouldn't think that there's nothing beyond this. It's just the last thing we can see. And now we're going to go back in. And as we go back in, we should think about this question. Are we alone? I mean, what is the likelihood in this? There are Caleb, what are the number of planets in our own galaxy, just our galaxy?
Oh, well, so we now know that every star in our galaxy has at least one planet, statistically speaking. Every star. And probably more than one planet. So that means
there's a couple 100 billion stars.
There's a couple 100 billion stars.
So there are more planets than stars.
Yeah, and there's even evidence of planets that have no star. Planets that are rogue. They've probably been ejected into interstellar space during the birth process around another star. And those planets alone could equal the number of stars. So it's a universe full of planets.
When did we realize that that was the case?
Pretty recently. 20 years ago, we didn't know if any other solar systems existed. And this has been one of the great revolutions in astronomy in recent years, is that we've suddenly hit upon the technological tricks and the computational tools to detect planets around other stars, which is very, very difficult. And so 20 years ago...
they're dim. I mean, you can't... not stupid. I don't mean stupid. I mean that they're just not bright.
They might be, right? And we might really
not have
be
intelligent life, right? But they're just not bright, so they're hard to see.
Yeah, a planet is small and dark, and a star is big and bright. And when you put them next to each other, many light years from us, they just merge into one point of brightness. And so we've had to rely on some very clever indirect trickery to deduce the presence of planets. But 20 years ago, we hadn't done that, and I guess really the first bona fide planet around a normal star was discovered in 1995, although when people went back and looked at their data, there were signs of planets before then. It's just the planets were so crazy people didn't recognize what they were seeing, because the very first planets that were observed were in architectures radically different than the architecture of our own solar system. So
the planets were like, there was all this discussion in the old days of habitable zones, and we were looking for Earth-like planets, and that's not the story anymore. Or is it? I mean,
well, it is and it isn't. I think, so there's this long-running idea that, okay, if we're going to find life somewhere else in the universe, it's going to be on a planet like the Earth, whatever that really means. And that, in part, means the planet orbits a star like the Sun at the same kind of distance that the Earth does. And that would tell you that there's a potential for the surface temperature of that planet, the surface environment, to kind of be like the Earth is as it is today. So it's a very strange definition. On the one hand, it's incredibly narrow and Earth-centric. On the other hand, it's so broad as to be almost meaningless, but it's kind of a starting point. A planet out at the distance that, say, Pluto is from the Sun, it's from the point of view of having tropical islands, it's not so good. And so,
but Nick, you have...
I think even 10 years ago, the icy moons of Saturn, for example, or of Jupiter, I don't think anybody would have seriously expected to find life on them, whereas now that's probably the biggest prospect in the solar system. And I think that's outside the conventional Goldilocks zone.
I think that's a really interesting shift. So if you think of every star system as having several planets, or at least some fraction having several planets, so there's more planets than there are stars, and then planets all having multiple moons, or many of them having multiple moons, and then the moons being the more likely location for the emergence of life is really kind of and you can't see moons. I mean, how are we going to look for this?
Well, actually, one of my colleagues at Columbia is looking for moons.
Right.
And it's really difficult. As you say, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. But yeah, this point about, in many respects, if you are just interested in oceans of water that have some contact with rocks, with minerals, which I think is...
Which is basically what I think, or a lot of people would think, is the most likely kind of environment. It's an Earth-like environment still, in the sense that it's a rocky planet or moon with an ocean. And it's actually it's the interactions between the rocks and the water that are driving all the chemistry which might have given rise to life in the first place. So that's why we're so excited about Europa and Enceladus and places.
Right, because they have very similar conditions, and they're volcanic, right? So there's a warmth to them that's...
Well, we think. But what I was just going to say, just to put this in some kind of perspective, is we now think... So we've heard about Europa, icy moon of Jupiter with a potential ocean beneath an icy crust, and there's Enceladus around Saturn. It's even got active geysers of water that appears salty. It appears even to have particulates in it that could have been produced by hydrothermal vent systems. But if you do the numbers, if you crunch the numbers for all the icy bodies in the outer solar system, you actually come up with a total volume of ocean 16 times that of Earth's oceans. And it's not close to the sun. It's not in conventional planets around orbiting a star. It's in these moons around giant planets.
So why haven't we found evidence of life there?
We've
Why are we alone, Caleb? Why are we alone?
Why are we alone? Well, so it was interesting. This will take it off in a slightly different direction. To answer it in terms of the solar system, part of the issue is we just haven't looked very closely, and we've sent the wrong sorts of missions. The mission that discovered the geysers in Enceladus, mission called Cassini, was never designed to look for signs of life. So we've been, it's interesting, we've been extraordinarily cautious in our exploration of the solar system compared to the way we were back in the 70s. Anyway, so...
I mean, if that hadn't gone, we wouldn't have known about the geysers at all, would we? We can't see them from here.
Right, well,
do you suspect that the life is under the surface and not on the surface? I mean, is that the suspicion, because it's so cold on the surface that you're more likely to have the kind of fluidity or things?
Yeah, I think, Nick,
well, that would certainly be my suspicion.
That
yes.
they're deeper in.
As soon as you start thinking about it statistically, and there's all these billions upon billions of planets, probably wet rocky planets in our solar system, in our galaxy alone, then statistically it seems almost a no-brainer that there's got to be life out there. But yes.
All right, I'm going to start being
Yes.
argumentative.
Right.
No, well, yeah, but I think...
I mean, this is the power of big numbers. I think this is part of the problem, because we don't have a basis for that kind of statistics. We cannot say, so we have the perfect conditions perhaps on Earth, at least these are the conditions we're looking for elsewhere. Are these the kind of conditions that would almost inevitably give rise to life? Or was it actually a freak accident? We don't know. I mean, different people have different views. Science itself has to have a view, otherwise none of us would be here. We have to believe that it's a scientifically addressable problem, which means that it's not a freak accident. And it also means that God didn't do it from that point of view as well, because otherwise there'd be no point studying
Can't
it.
freak accidents be part of the scientific, I mean, we discover sometimes freak accidents.
Yes, they can be, and you can get at them. But I think if the reality is that all of these billions upon billions of planets are completely sterile and lifeless, I think it would be utterly disappointing.
So Caleb, I know you have a response, but then I'd like to turn to the actual emergence of life in the one place where we know it happened.
Yeah, and the reason I was waggling my finger wasn't to completely disagree, but I mean, it's this interesting situation, because I fully agree that the discovery of billions of planets out there, and we didn't know how frequently planets occurred until 20 years ago, so it is a big deal. And in fact, the latest estimates are that of those planets, the fraction that could conceivably resemble the Earth, at least in terms of size and their orbit, is roughly 1 in 4. So, which is extraordinary. 1 in 4 stars harbor a planet that could be like the Earth. And so you're faced with these enormous numbers, tens of billions of conceivably Earth-analog planets. And the instinct is to say, well, can we really be the only living planet? But I just want to, and this is just me being cold, hard, logical, scientist, disappointing person sitting in the corner, because no one will talk to him over cocktails.
That's why I put you over there.
Yeah, should I move further in this direction? The truth of it is, though, at this point, although that is such a tempting leap to make, in terms of the pure analysis, the probabilistic analysis, based on what we know about this world and what we know about life on the Earth and how long it's been around and so on, we actually have no constraint, no meaningful constraint. We could be the first life. No, so I'm just being that party pooper.
I'm going to disagree with you and then on that.
All right, okay. So, but if you do what's called a Bayesian analysis, and it's not so surprising. We only have like one data point. Extrapolating from that is extremely difficult. But what I would say is that all it would take would be one other instance of life that has evolved independently of our life to completely change those statistics in favor of a universe teeming with life. But I'd be interested to know what your objection is.
So I don't really see it statistically at all, being not a physicist, I suppose. I see it in terms of what are the principles that lead to the emergence of life here or anywhere else. And those principles are really grounded in geology and in chemistry. And so we have a sample size of 1, that's true. But water is very common, carbon is very common. The kind of hydrothermal systems that I think perhaps gave rise to life on Earth, we suspect that they are, the methane that people detect on Mars almost certainly was produced by those kind of rock-water interactions. Same things on Enceladus and other moons. So these are going on everywhere. And so the question is, well, what are the probability that these kind of reactions will tend to drive the right kind of chemistry for life? Now, we can't answer that yet because we don't know enough. I mean, I would say it's highly likely that all of these planets will produce these very same kind of vents, which will end up producing a lot of organic carbon.
Well, let's talk about the emergence
but organic
of life.
Carbon's the easy bit. It's the next steps, and
Right,
we
so
have no idea yet how difficult they are.
We all sort of have heard that carbon is really crucial to life, but the story's obviously progressed significantly since those days where we just said, oh, all you need is carbon. It's become incredibly much more complex. So I think 2 things. One is that we're talking about the emergence of life in the universe that is on places similar to our planet and therefore going to mimic the evolution of life on our planet, and I would like to later get to what kind of life forms can we imagine that are just completely divergent from that premise. I mean, maybe we're rare, but if you're telling us 1 out of 4 planets are Earth-like, then even if we're rare, I mean, it says that there's a lot of places where we can at least look for something that we know. But there's stuff we haven't, we'll get to. But what I do want to tease out from Nick is this discussion, which I was blown away about when I read your book. How difficult, this is a cell. Yes. Even I know that. I'm a physicist. This is a cell. And the emergence of life on Earth, I always sort of felt, oh, Darwinian evolution made it inevitable, and the logical step was complex life, and then there's conscious life, and this is not an obvious path at all. And if you could tell us a little bit about how difficult that story is.
Well, it's a very surprising path, really, because life started on Earth very early on, so far as we can tell, about 4 billion years ago.
Which suggests that simple life is easy.
Well,
or wouldn't
yes,
it?
I mean, Caleb would say no, it doesn't suggest that, and he's quite right. Again, there could be. It could just be that it takes 4 billion years to get to complex life, and therefore we had to be on a planet.
Simple life, like single-celled organisms, were here right away?
Well, they were here very early on, and I tend to think that it's not such a difficult problem, but I don't really have any scientific basis for that beyond...
For how single-celled life evolved.
Yes. I mean, I think the conditions in these vents will produce...
So
quite a lot of organic carbon,
and
will tend to drive. It's almost like a living planet. It's as if the planet is driving the same kind of reactions as life does itself.
Okay,
I'd be
just for a
surprised
momentary digression. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but a momentary digression. Is there a sense in which the entire planet is alive? I mean, here's a softball question. What is life?
There is no answer to that. Nobody can agree about that. I would say life is parasitic on its environment. That's about the best I'm going to do.
Is it conceivable that the entire Earth is an organism in a sense that we're unable to recognize?
Well, that would be the Gaia hypothesis, I suppose. And it's, there's some truth in it, but it's not true in the sense that really to have serious complexity as an organism, you must have natural selection. We don't know of any other mechanism that would possibly do that. And to have natural selection, you must have populations of things. So there's no way that, if you had populations of competing planets, then perhaps you could in some way, but there's no way that the Earth is an organism in that sense. But it's living in the sense that it's geologically active, it's far from equilibrium, it's structured in many ways. And so it's conducive to the origins of life. Life effectively does what the planet does anyway, but does it better. It's
well, we could have
difficult.
arguments about first generations of stars and second generations that permute and therefore make rocky planets, and third generations and things like this. It'd be a 14 billion year timescale, but
right. I mean, it's interesting because we do tend to start applying these concepts to systems like the Earth because we have this familiarity with life. I wanted to give you almost a physicist's response to this. Is the Earth alive? And I would say it's not really alive. What's interesting though is so the Earth is this object that forms, and it's got all this energy it wants to dissipate because it wants to reach thermodynamic equilibrium with the rest of the universe that is at 3 Kelvin. Right, and
that's cold in Fahrenheit.
That's
What is that in Fahrenheit? It's really,
Fahrenheit? What sort
really
of system
cold.
is that? And so basically, the Earth, like any planet, spends its existence trying to get rid of energy, trying to dissipate energy. And I would say that what's so fascinating is that, from my physicist's point of view, life is one of the mechanisms that has arisen on the planet to help with that dissipation. But it is this extraordinarily complex set of dissipation processes, some of which involve actually sort of grabbing energy, making yourself locally worse in terms of thermodynamic equilibrium in order to get to a place where you can do a better job at globally getting rid of energy.
Can I just take a second on thermodynamic equilibrium? I mean, the point is really that the Earth is hotter than space, and so it's cooling.
Yes, sorry, I was trying to show off and use long words.
Well, totally showing off. Yes. So the Earth is trying to get to be as cold as its environment. If its environment was hot, it would be trying to heat up and get as hot as its environment. And what's an interesting idea that you just said right now, which actually I hadn't thought of really before, is that we're playing a role in this attempt, and that's in some sense why the planet accommodates us, why we function in the whole ecosystem of the planet. We're working
and I
towards
guess what
that
I was
inevitable
and what I was
goal.
trying to get at, it was perhaps connected to what Nick said, that there is this sort of impetus, there's a natural push towards ways of dissipating energy, and
Yes,
life
yeah.
fits
So I mean,
that.
just to give one single and simple example, so ultraviolet radiation, for example, will tend to split water. And as it splits water, it's producing hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen can evaporate away into space, and the oxygen, well, it could collect in the atmosphere, but the chances are it's going to react with rocks with iron in them, for example.
Oxygen's highly
Photosynthesis-
unstably reactive,
yeah.
right?
Photosynthesis does basically the same thing. It splits water, and it takes the hydrogen and it reacts it with carbon to make sugars and so on. And the oxygen, it doesn't want the oxygen, so it pumps it out in such large amounts that it does accumulate in the atmosphere. So what life has done is exactly what cosmic radiation is, or ultraviolet radiation is doing. It's just doing it on a massively greater scale. But trying to detect life on another planet, it's really hard to say. If you've just got a bacterial planet and these processes are not really going on a massive scale, it's really, really difficult to tell the difference.
Yeah, this is why people in exoplanetary science who study planets around other stars are permanently depressed, because, yeah, well, I mean, that's not really fair. They get very excited because they find planets, and then someone will say, well, do you know if there's life on the planet? And they sort of look sheepish and say, well, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, maybe in 100 years. Yeah, no, well, this is the thing, right? Well, our filter for the universe, the fact that we have such a limited capacity still to examine distant worlds, screws us.
Well, let's talk about this one, because we know it happened here. And I know you were about to discuss the thermal vents, the hydrothermal vents in the deepest ocean, and that I'm going to preempt what you're going to say, because you think that's the locus of the actual origin of life on the planet. Is that right?
Well, that wasn't what I was about to say. But
okay, well, that's all right. That's what you're going to say now. Say
you
that
mentioned
now.
it's hot. You mentioned the Earth is hot. I just finished with the last point before coming on to that. But it's not just the heat which is driving it. It's also the fact that you've got all the iron. It's basically gravity. The iron is sinking down into the core and into the mantle and so on, and the lighter rocks are at the top. And the atmosphere and the oceans are relatively oxidized. So there's a disequilibrium between effectively lots of electrons deep down and relatively few electrons further up, which again is very similar to what a cell is structured like.
So essentially the whole electromagnetic process, just the idea of basically making little batteries out of environments where charge flows down a wire. It doesn't have to actually be a copper wire made in a factory, but
it
something,
can be a whole planet or it can be a cell.
Right, that provides the path for things to travel when the battery is created.
And that path is the hydrothermal vents in this particular case.
And so this is fascinating. Before this happened, the Earth had, complex molecules and amino acids and yes, no?
Yes, I mean, they're delivered from space, they're formed in vents, they're formed in the oceans. I mean, it seems
and they're
to
not
be
alive.
very,
There's,
easy.
there was no life.
Alive,
We considered it inanimate. We're not going to get bogged down in the definition of what life is. But then there's this battery created in these hydrothermal vents where there's this sort of ability to have energy transported. It's really energy transport that's important.
I would see energy and matter as the two sides of the same coin, because what's flowing down there is it's a mixture of hydrogen and CO2 and electricity, and it's really the electricity which is forcing the hydrogen to react with the carbon dioxide. So it's the energy is driving the reactions.
So the idea is in these hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean, you've created this electrical situation where it can transport, using the charges of the molecules, it can transport them and combine them and begin to reorganize them in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I should say for for the sake of being reasonable that not everybody agrees with these ideas. I mean, it's a field that very few people can agree about anything at all. So anything I say about the origin of life, Caleb probably doesn't have a particularly strong viewpoint on what environment specifically life arises in. I don't know. But,
No, I'll give you that.
but lots of people do. And so I think it's hydrothermal vents because I'm a biologist. And so I'm looking for what environments on Earth do the same kind of things as cells.
But so let me see if I understand this. Then in the hydrothermal vents, the first simple single-celled organisms form.
Yes.
And then they repeat the process internally. They have some electrical properties, they have some ability to conduct molecules, and that's the sense in which they're able to find the energy to reproduce and to...
Yeah, I mean, cells have a structure.
Metabolize.
I mean, it's you know, just think of it as a balloon or something, but the balloon is not just the cell is not just a bag with a membrane around it. Everything that's important is going on across the membrane.
So it's
the
allowing
difference
stuff
between
to
the
flow in
inside
and
and the
out.
outside. And that's what's powering everything. That's what's powering the formation of organic matter, and it's what's powering the reactions, the energy that powers the reactions.
So, of course, you both know these early experiments where people tried to make the famed primordial earth soup, and they would make amino acids, but they wouldn't make any organic life.
Yes.
There was no, so why aren't these experiments better? Like, why can't I do this in the laboratory? Why can't I take this situation, throw in some fats and some acids, and then create batteries and electrical properties and watch?
Well, we are trying to do that in the laboratory. We've not got that far yet.
Evil
I have to admit,
genius. Yeah.
well, we wanted to build this reactor in the basement of the Darwin building at UCL. So Darwin lived in a house right where this building is. He hated UCL, in fact. He wasn't part of UCL. But he lived in a house there. This is the Darwin building, and we built a reactor to try and see if we could simulate the conditions in these hydrothermal vents and do those first reactions of life. And
how's it going?
we ended up on the 6th floor, and it doesn't work nearly as well on the 6th floor.
Why is that? What's wrong with the 6th floor?
It just doesn't have the same Frankenstein overtones to it, I think. But
so you're all at the pub instead of in the basement.
Just to add,
I mean, in effect, what we're doing is trying to break down step by step. It's a tremendously long and complex continuum, and it's you know, it's not a single experiment.
maybe just to add, I mean, this is a comment and a sort of question for you. I mean, and something you meant, you were talking about these early experiments. There's a famous, the Miller-Urey experiment, where they basically filled a flask with some compounds and sparked electricity through it, and lo and behold, they made some nice organic molecules. And for a long time, that was kind of seen as a way to make that primordial soup. But my understanding is that, I mean, apart from the fact that it didn't get much further than just making a bunch of organic molecules, one of the issues is this whole old picture of the primordial soup on a young Earth. One of the things it runs into is there was a lot of ocean, and
it's
that
just a false
creates this
picture,
dilution. And isn't that true that the dilution problem is one of the things that your hydrothermal vents helps solve?
Yes, because you have heat actually solves it in the vents, because you have convection currents cycling within the vents themselves. And it's a little bit like, I like to think of it as the way that socks get tangled up inside the duvet cover in the washing machine. That effectively they've got lots of kinetic energy, they bounce around the place until they get inside the duvet cover, and then there's less freedom of movement, so they stick there. And the same thing happens to organic molecules in these vents. In the warmer bits, there's lots of kinetic energy. In the cooler bits, they stick there. And we've done it in a completely open system in the lab, where we've simulated a kind of porous structure just from aluminium oxide. And we can concentrate simple organics 30 million-fold, even though they could flow straight out of the top. So it really does solve this problem of how do you concentrate things.
So let's say we're just looking at single-celled organisms. Even if you don't know the details, you have a pretty strong feeling. It's not your greatest mystery, if I understand correctly. I mean, your feeling of the greatest mystery is the emergence of single-celled organisms, but they waffle for a while. They just stay that way for a long,
well, I mean, two and a half billion years
long
or so.
time. Yeah.
Yes, I mean,
2.5 billion years.
Yeah.
That's it. And then what happens?
Well, then complex cells arise.
How?
Well, again, nobody can agree about any of this.
But I know your story, and I really want you to tell it.
My story, and there's quite a lot of evidence for it, is that one cell got inside another one. And a very simple cells, so bacterial-like cells.
So there's two simple cells. One, they're both single-celled. And a bacterium, you think, basically somehow jams itself into the other cell, which sounds like a pretty destructive process.
Well, we have no idea really how it got in. And there's various different versions. So a lot of people here will be familiar with Lynn Margulis and the idea, she basically introduced these ideas back in the 1960s, but she had a serial endosymbiosis theory. So there were lots and lots of these things happening all the time.
She didn't like the theory of competition. She liked she favored the idea that there was more snuggling up. Yeah. And that helped push along
and she was, in many ways, she was right. But the evidence that we have suggests that she wasn't right, that it was a whole series of separate ones. All we really have evidence for are two. One of them was the mitochondria, which started out as bacteria. They're the powerhouses in our cells. Mm-hmm. Another one in plants are the chloroplasts. They also started out as bacteria. But everything else, there's no evidence that anything else ever started out as a bacteria and became an integrated part of the cell. So
basically, for 2.5 billion years, single-celled organisms are just living happily. They still are. And they still are, and there's still the greater biomass on the Earth. And by some accident, some bacterium injects itself into another cell, and it doesn't die, this combination. It somehow survives.
They probably needed each other in one way. I mean, they were probably literally were snuggling up to each other for exchanging goods. Mm-hmm. But again, it's very difficult to reconstruct. We can try and do it by comparing genes. Mm-hmm. But the strange thing about this is that all plants, for example, and animals, we have almost the same set of genes. There's some differences, but a plant cell, like the one you had up there before, that's actually an alga, pond scum, really, euglena. Mm-hmm. It's an enormously complex cell. I have this on my desktop at work to remind me what I have to try and explain.
Not the actual cell, the picture, people, the picture.
No, it reminds me of the level of complexity. This is about maybe 70 millionths of a millimeter. Sorry, yes, long. 70,000th of a millimeter long. So it's really very, very small. And yet within it, there's this enormous complexity.
So this is post this episode?
This is after this episode, yes.
But the stunning thing is that you're telling me it happened one time in the history of the Earth.
Well, it seems to have happened one time.
And so
which is to say, all the complex life we've ever seen has exactly that same structure.
So basically, the pond scum and all of us are about 50% similar genetically, or?
Well, everything that you can see in there, apart from these wavy structures at the edge, those are chloroplasts, but everything else in there pretty much you have in your own cells.
So it is different. Yeah.
So this is an alga.
Right.
So, right. But pretty much everything else is the same, and all the genes that are required to make it are exactly the same.
So we are technically very much related to bok choy, or kale, or something.
Yeah, we're kind of 50% banana.
I thought we were more related to fungus. Aren't we more related to fungus?
We are a lot more related to fungus. Yes, we are. But still, we're far more closely related to that than we are to bacteria.
So, but we have bacterial DNA, which we carry in a vestigial way, right? We're not necessarily. Some of it's used, but isn't some of it in the mitochondria not used?
Some is in. Well, everything in the mitochondria is used.
I got a crash lesson in biology yesterday.
So the mitochondria, these power packs, they always do retain their own genes. Mm-hmm. But they also lost a lot, and a lot of the ones that they lost ended up going across to the nucleus, which is the main kind of storage dump for DNA. And so a lot of the genes there derive from bacteria. But we don't really know what they...
So given that all complex life forms on the Earth are traceable back to this single event after 2.5 billion years of waffling, what does that say about the likelihood of life emerging? I mean, does that mean that this was a spectacularly rare event? I mean, maybe it happened other times, but they didn't survive, right? The merger of two cells. Maybe they've tried this before and failed.
We know of a couple of examples of this kind of thing. So it must have happened. If we know of two now, then there must have been millions upon millions of examples.
But they all failed. They all failed.
Well,
except
there's
this
no
one.
Evidence of them having succeeded, really.
But does that mean that given that the oceans are full of bacterium and single-celled organisms, that right now that could be happening again, that there's a whole other thread?
There is actually. I finished my book with an epilogue of one cell that was discovered on the flanks of a hydrothermal vent off the coast of Japan, and it's not it's not a cell as we know it. It's somewhere between the two, and it's very, very peculiar. And it does look to me as if this is another origin of complex life, even though it's actually.
So the aliens are already here.
Oh,
there are terrestrial
oceans.
aliens as opposed to extraterrestrial aliens. But that's really a stunning fact. If all life is related, and then there are new threads that are starting, new threads of the tree of life. Caleb, you were?
Yeah, well, actually, just to pick that up, I mean, that's the sort of thing that gets astrobiologists really excited because, as I'm listening to the conversation, I come back to something that is incredibly important for me in terms of wanting to understand it, which is to evaluate the probability of, any life happening in a particular environment, and then certainly the probability of more complex life, whatever that really means. I think in this case, we're talking about life that's capable of more efficient energy use and more, of having larger sets of genetic information and utilizing that, which you have to have that extra power source to do. Because for astrobiology, and for the question of are we alone, right, it's not just, well, is there anyone else out there, as a sort of emotional question and answer, but what I would like to be able to do is go around the universe and go, right, that moon probability of life being there is X, that planet probability of life being there, that galaxy, this is the probability of life being there, and so on. And I think when you step back to ask those sorts of questions, it gets even more difficult, because then you come up against these questions that you just started to get to of assigning likelihood, assigning probability to these, this seemingly unique or semi-unique event that caused the creation of animal cells, right? So the incorporation of mitochondria in this endosymbiotic relationship. And that gets really, really hairy for me, because
for most people, I think.
Yeah.
And for me, frankly, as well.
Right.
It is very hairy territory.
And some of the hairiness is not just because I don't understand the biology well enough. It's coming at it from a pure, again, probabilistic point of view. I really am the guy in the corner of the room who nobody will talk to because I keep talking about statistics and probability. And it's to do with, and I know I go on about this in my book as well, this idea of the interpretation of events after they've happened, that very unlikely things and very probable things, when they've happened, unless you know better, are indistinguishable from each other. And so, you're then in the situation where you go back and you start to, you talk about contingency, right?
Yes, I mean, the example you use in your book, I remember reading that passage, is someone throwing a ball in a baseball game or something, and someone catches it, and it's amazing that this guy catches it, but it would have been one guy catches it. But that's not the case with eukaryotes, because it really,
complex organisms.
Complex organisms. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting where I am. That's the term. So for these complex cell types, they're called eukaryotes. It just means true nucleus or true kernel. It's like a nut at the center of the cell. But so far as we can tell, that really did happen once, and it's not as if something else caught the ball. There wasn't another ball. There wasn't anyone else to catch it.
Let's ask what we might look for in the universe. So there's two different ways to look. One is to look astronomically, to look and see if there are gases in certain atmospheres, or we can see metabolic processes happening and we can blame it on a life form, because that is at least some component of the definition of life, is that we metabolize, we respire, we change the environment, as you're saying. And but another way is to listen. This is SETI, the famous search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And people used to laugh at SETI, but they really don't anymore. I really feel that the mood has changed. If you look at the neighborhood 400 light years around us, let's say, how many exoplanets do you think that there are? That is to say, planets outside of our solar system.
Oh, within 400 light years?
400 light years.
Oh, wow, I have to do the numbers.
Even within 70 light years, where we've sent our signals, it must be hundreds.
Right. Yeah.
Just where that little ball of the first signal sent out into space, there are hundreds of other planets. So even though it seems foolish to be listening, if you were a life form on another planet that also understood electromagnetism, which is the core, in some sense, of the emergence of life, you wouldn't be that foolish for listening for an electromagnetic signal.
Yeah, and so this is, I mean, so you're right. SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has kind of come back into people's vision, and some of it is because it's getting money. It's gotten money from Yuri Milner, the Russian billionaire, about $100 million over the next 10 years to try to do a better job at listening. And it's, yeah, SETI is fascinating because when you start to examine the difficulty of, you talked about chemical signatures in atmospheres and the fact that maybe a planet has bacteria living in it, but not enough to make a substantial signature that you could observe from light years away. The beauty of SETI is if you succeed, not only have you found someone else to actually talk to, but you've jumped across all of those questions and you've shown that, yes, complex life has occurred in at least one other place in the universe. And that changes the statistics enormously. Suddenly it means that complex life is going to be quite frequent in the universe. But...
Does it?
Well, yeah,
so
actually,
far,
I mean, roughly speaking.
How many aliens have we heard from?
Well, do you count people on the street of New York?
We don't count the new life form in the vents. And, you know...
So absolutely none. And so, yeah, so SETI is like the ultimate high-risk game, right? You could spend a lifetime, and people have spent lifetimes.
Well, who might we be interested in hearing from? I mean, what would we expect? A life form that is sophisticated enough to intentionally send us signals. What do we expect? It's obviously not the bacteria we're discussing. It's not, zebras running on the plane. What kind of life form would we expect to have made it through the galaxy? Presumably not in our neighborhood. They could be 4 billion years older than us as a civilization.
Okay, so I could talk for the next 6 hours on this.
Okay, you got 5 minutes.
So it's a really good question. You know, the first answer is I have no bloody idea, right? What it's going to be like, and you know, one of the drawbacks with SETI, one of the criticisms that you can level at it is again so based around our own template, so based around our own motivations.
So let's think of stuff that's outside of that. What would we
guess? So one way to cut through that, I think, and you put your finger on it, is this question of, what is the most, if other life is out there, and through whatever mechanism it gets to a level of complexity and sophistication that it's either out exploring the cosmos, or it's sending signals out, or it's listening for signals, what type of life manages to survive and do that? And there's a lot of debate at the moment on extrapolating our own circumstances. You end up saying it's going to be machines. It's probably not going to be conventional biological life as we understand it. Now, there's a whole world of things going on in there, but it is kind of fascinating when you look at the trajectory of human technology and what it takes to actually be an interstellar species. If you're doing more than just sitting at home watching alien Netflix and occasionally transmitting a signal, Game of Thrones, yes, to go through interstellar space, biology is probably lousy for that. You want to be a machine. And that opens up a whole realm of interesting possibilities. Because
so you essentially think that as a civilization progresses enough, that in order to colonize the galaxy or be interested in exploring the galaxy, that they're much more likely either to have completely replaced their entire population by machines, or they're simply sending the machines in their stead to explore the galaxy?
Well, again, and I'm doing the same thing that I just criticized SETI for by being very Earth-centric. Look, so we now have a project called Breakthrough Starshot, which is also funded by Yuri Milner, the Russian billionaire, which is an early plan to send spacecraft to probably the Proxima Centauri star, the closest star to us, which we now know has at least one planet, which could actually be one of those Earth analog planets, which is pretty remarkable.
It's about 4 light years away.
It's 4 light years away, 24 trillion miles, so just next door. And what are we thinking of sending? We're thinking of sending robots.
Right. I mean, Voyager would take 35,000 years to get to Proxima Centauri because it doesn't travel at the speed of light.
That's
But
right.
what are the machines that we're thinking of sending instead?
Well, so the idea for Project Starshot is very ambitious. It is to send nano spacecraft, tiny little things that weigh less than a gram, and they're sort of this big, and to blow them to another star at least 20% the speed of light by firing big lasers at them. And using, so light can exert a pressure. And
So they'll get there in, what, a decade or two?
yeah, 20 years maybe. And they, in principle, they'll fly through the system. They're not going to ever slow down once you set them in motion. And you send not just one, but swarms of these things because, well, some aren't going to survive, and you want to have a distributed computing system and so on. So they'll zip through the Centauri system in matter of literally hours. But they would send back
If somebody
a
sent
picture.
that to us, we wouldn't really notice.
Right. We have no idea if that sort of thing is happening to us, and in fact, we would not notice at all. For all we know, there are
Next time a
swarms.
postage stamp drifts down at your feet, you might like that. You might have made contact.
Well, there are actually people who are constantly kind of picking up dust particles from the upper atmosphere and so on, and I think we have a pretty good idea of what's in the upper atmosphere, don't we?
We have a good idea, yeah, but if you imagine, suppose a few nano spacecraft zip through our system, the odds of them whacking into the Earth are minimal. These things could be flying through the solar system all the time. We'd never notice it. And I'm not suggesting that they are, but it'd be. So this is one of the interesting questions, and I don't know if we're going to get to the Fermi paradox. You mentioned that earlier when
We've sort of been talking about it, but not naming it.
Yeah. So shall I say what that is? So there's this thing called the Fermi paradox, and it's a bit of an apocryphal story, but it goes back to famous physicist Enrico Fermi, who you may have heard of. And the story goes that in the 1950s, he was sitting around having lunch with some other famous physicists, and it was the space age, and they were talking about the possibilities of interstellar travel. And the tale goes that at some point, Fermi, who'd been listening, kind of puts his head up and goes, "Where is everybody?" And he wasn't referring to his lunch colleagues. What he was referring to was the fact that if interstellar travel is possible, and this was the 1950s, so people were very gung-ho and optimistic about what humans would be doing, then in his head he'd worked out, because he's a great physicist, that if you take the number of stars in the galaxy and the distance between them, it actually, if you set out to colonize the galaxy, it would not take that long, even going at quite slow speeds. And so it would only take a few tens of millions of years. And yet, the galaxy's been around for billions of years. So where is everybody? Why hadn't we been visited? Does that mean that life is incredibly unlikely, or incredibly unlikely to ever become interstellar? So that is the Fermi paradox.
Right, so there's some question about whether or not what has been referred to as a great filter, right, is behind us or ahead of us. I mean, let's presume that single-celled life isn't that hard, let's just say for the sake of argument, then maybe we've overcome the great barrier to the emergence of complex life already, and it's behind us, and we really are the first. Or maybe it's ahead of us because we're a slightly suicidal species that has been around for a couple 100,000 years, is on verge of self-extinction. Whereas if we look at things like the dinosaurs, they roamed for like 250 million years. Like, weren't they a more successful species than us? So maybe the great filter's ahead of us. Maybe we're just here to do something with the equilibrium and allow the next generation of species to emerge on Earth. And they might not want to colonize because they might not be as greedy about energy. Yeah,
so the great filter is an interesting thing. And actually, just to give you a little story about it, which relates to this question of looking for life in the universe. So the philosopher and physicist Nick Bostrom in Oxford has actually made what I think is probably the most gloomy and pessimistic argument that I've ever seen, but it's sort of interesting. He says, because of the great filter, we really do not want to discover that there is life anywhere else in the universe.
No news is good news?
Well, and his argument is, suppose we go and find life on Mars that evolved independently of life on the Earth. Suddenly that ups the odds for life occurring all across the universe. But then you have to ask, well then, where is it? And his answer is the great filter. And it means also we're on the wrong side of the great filter.
It's ahead of us.
It's ahead of us.
I just want to, just because I have them here, these old vintage NASA posters about colonizing the solar system. They're really quite amazing. Colonizing, this is the optimism that you were describing, Caleb, colonizing other planets. They're really quite fantastic, and it's almost an era we're coming back to in some sense while we discuss exploring the solar system. But what does it say? Your oasis in space, Earth. I love the idea that Earth is not in outer space, everything else is. But let's talk about this idea of energy, because in some sense, the emergence of this energy, ability to transport energy or to, in the thermal vents and create cells that harness energy in the same way, metabolize or respire. Human beings consume a lot of energy, and in order to explore the galaxy or colonize, if we wanted to do it, we would have to think of things like the Dyson sphere or the Dyson swarm, which we won't get into in great detail, but is an attempt to basically solar panel the entire sun and harness the energy of the entire sun in order to do that. So does that mean that there's something unstable about species that try to colonize the galaxy, because to do so would require mining the entire solar system, destroying Venus, destroying Mars, taking elements from them? I mean, there's no way to do that without catastrophic mining.
Yeah. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure how to answer that, but
that's what we're here for. This is the hard stuff. This is the phase of SciCon where, I used to have a professor, sorry to interrupt you, at MIT. He would say, every talk should have something everyone can understand out of respect for the audience, something only a few people can understand out of respect for the experts, and something nobody can understand out of respect for physics. So that's where we are at this point in the conversation.
So I think, if I remember the question now, it's really, are we going to destroy everything by going to other places or even sending?
Yes, it's even the value system involved with colonizing inherently going to have its own cap or limitation.
I think that the question then really depends on, well, what are we actually destroying? Are we destroying life elsewhere? And we don't know if there's life elsewhere. We don't even know if there's life on Mars. To find out if there's life on Mars, we have to dig down by about 1 meter or more, and we haven't done that yet, which is extraordinary, really. But obviously, there's not going to be any life on the surface of Mars, but there may be life lower down. So whether or not you want to terraform Mars would depend a great deal on whether there is actually life on Mars and whether we should protect it in some way. And there are very earnest committees who worry about these kind of questions. But I think one of the great things about humanity is this urge to explore and to discover things. And from my point of view as a scientist thinking about these questions, I suppose I have a fairly pessimistic view in the sense that I don't find the Fermi paradox a paradox at all, because it's not only the origin of complex life, there's all kinds of other steps along the way to getting to humans. If you just go back by, let's say, 100,000 years, there was nothing on this planet that was sending any form of message out into space. The dinosaurs dominated for a massively long time. So we can have enormously complex life on an extremely sophisticated planet, but nothing which is capable of getting into space.
Yeah, I guess that's my question. The dinosaurs were so successful compared to us just in terms of longevity. We're less successful already in the sense that we are on some precipice. Maybe we'll turn it around, but we're not going in a great direction. So does that mean that the kind of life that's more successful is less likely to want to colonize the galaxy?
So I mean, it's very, and obviously, this has been in the news recently with Elon Musk announcing his slightly mad plans to go to Mars. So putting aside the questions of screwing up other places and other indigenous life forms that we would actually do well to study before we go and mess up those environments. I mean, I think he does have a point about the backup plan. And this is something that does differentiate. This is maybe the only, so we're a kind of frenetic little species compared to the dinosaurs. Well, of course, there are many generations of dinosaurs and lots of evolution within what we call the dinosaur period. But they, in pure terms, they were enormously successful. And here we are with this frenetic set of organisms going like crazy, and we can already evaluate ourselves and see ways in which we're going to kill ourselves. And so, he may have a point that for a species like us, going off-world, going interstellar or going to other planets is the only way to ensure our longevity as a species. But it comes with enormous risk, right? And as you mentioned, it's a balance between exploiting what you've got to start with in order to make the next jump and to become self-sustaining somewhere else, and then to just keep doing that for the next billion years.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also something we sort of touched upon, which is that consciousness is not necessarily some endpoint of natural selection and evolution. It might just be a digression
Well,
along
some
the
form
way.
of consciousness seems to have emerged pretty much everywhere across animals, at least. Not in plants, to the best of my knowledge. I mean, there's nothing that really.
Okay, so that was too strongly stated,
Yeah.
but in the sense that
But
we
I mean,
mean
human level
yes.
of consciousness, it's only in us, and,
Right.
and
Yes.
yes, and it seems to again there's some kind of freak accident going on in that as well.
Can you remind me what this critter is called?
Oh, that's a tardigrade. Yes.
And they
A
can
water
survive.
bear,
They
call
can
them as
survive
well.
in.
They could survive in space pretty much.
You
yes.
could accidentally have one on the foot of the Mars rover, and then we go to Mars and we go, oh my God, there's life on Mars. Like, how careful have we been to not contaminate Mars? Not that careful.
Although,
I mean,
nature has actually probably contaminated Mars long before us.
By sending bits of
Because
rock.
there's been
and-
exchange of, any time an asteroid hits the Earth, or Mars for that matter, there's, what's
That's
that?
a real creature. That's an octopus that I
Okay.
just discovered. the other
But
day.
every time an asteroid hits Earth or Mars, which has happened many, many times over the last 4 billion years, there's exchange of material. And for all we know, and it seems quite reasonable to expect, the exchange of organisms like bacteria or maybe possibly tardigrades, just naturally. So the more maverick solar system explorers I know will say, oh, don't worry about Mars, it's already a mess. We've already contaminated it. But Europa, because it's sealed off by that crust of ice or Enceladus, might actually be a better target then, because it might hold truly indigenous life.
We would be able to tell the difference. I mean, if we arrive on Mars and we find bacteria, if you found a tardigrade, you'd know it came from Earth. If you found bacteria, that would be more interesting in a sense, because you wouldn't know if bacteria are a kind of default cell type that will arise almost anywhere. And if you look and the DNA, it has DNA. Let's say, would it have DNA?
And it
These
would
are
not
interesting
have
questions,
the
but a
same-
different code, for
Right, a
example.
different code. Because we're all related, which is quite remarkable, because we're related to this guy, the octopus, the little, what do they, I
yes.
think it's called the Dumbo octopus. When we're talking about all of this stuff in terms of other life in the solar system, what I get concerned about is we're still so imagining creatures like ourselves that want to harness technology, when these are the kinds of things, that we find on Earth. That's a real thing. This is a creature, I don't even know if it has a face. I'm sorry, I forgot what it was called. This is one of the oldest creatures on the Earth. Lampreys, is that what they're called? I feel like some people know what they are. People are nodding. Yes. That's sort of a mouth-like thing. Those are many of them. And this is, how old is this creature? Hundreds.
About 400 million years old.
Hundreds of millions of years. We are nowhere near that kind of a timescale. Jellyfish, 500 million years?
Yes.
Something like that. Does it even have a mouth? Sort of. Not really. Doesn't really have a mouth. So it seems to me, just if we're so insistent on taking the examples of our own planet, that the longest lived creatures have no interest in Dyson spheres and
Yes.
rockets to
I mean,
Mars,
that's a
which isn't to
lesson.
shame us. I'm not, anti-human. I'm just saying, what are we really looking for? What other forms are we not even contemplating in this human-centric view? I mean, there are discussions, of more amorphous consciousness that's not in a bag of meat.
I think we come.
I consider this to be like a bag of meat. But, is it possible that in like Caleb's description that when we start moving towards machines or artificial intelligence that we shouldn't even be thinking about the confines of a body?
I think the point about machines is a very good one, but I think they're not going to arise spontaneously. Machines are going to be made by some organic. Now, why? Why would I think that? I think that because carbon is actually particularly good at what it does, and it's really abundant and it's pretty much everywhere. And so, perhaps I'm just unimaginative. I think this is one reason why it's important to keep exploring, because it's very easy to to think, okay, well, life has to be this way for this set of reasons, which are good reasons. And perhaps it's not. Perhaps perhaps none of us can just concede it.
Well,
but I think we do have to also think, again, scientifically, that the ground rules are, silicon, for example, is absolutely useless in comparison with carbon. It's really no good.
It doesn't combine
what
as
about
many
using
ways.
something instead of, yes, and the bonds are much weaker as well. I mean, you end up trying to build with sand instead of trying to build with, CO2 is effectively a Lego brick. You pluck it out of the air and you build molecules like DNA from it. You can't do that with anything other than carbon. So do you need a code as sophisticated as DNA to encode something as sophisticated as life? I think you probably do. And so, perhaps life doesn't have to be carbon-based, but on a probabilistic basis, if you were to find 1,000 life forms on exoplanets, I bet my bottom dollar that at least 995 of them were carbon-based, because just probabilistically, that's the way it's going to be.
Caleb?
Yeah, so I agree. I suspect, my guess is that given the nature of the carbon atom and the complexity of the molecular forms it can produce, and our hunch that life is perhaps the most complex system or complex phenomena in the universe, it's going to be organic chemistry. But this, I just want to step back again. This comes back to something I was starting to get at way back at the beginning of this conversation. And that's this concept of, something we don't know yet, which I think is absolutely fascinating and could help resolve a lot of these questions, and it would help answer this astrobiological question of what's the probability of any sort of life anywhere. And that is evaluating the universality of the phenomenon of life. So, for example, suppose we discover we can make life out of software. Suppose we make life out of software that reproduces with variation, exhibits Darwinian selection, is capable of making its own novelty, capable of open-ended evolution. To me, that would tell us that life is independent of the substrate at some level, or could be independent.
I would completely agree with that, except that I think the origin of life is not independent of the
right.
substrate.
Well, so
once life emerges, it can make something else,
which can then make itself, in effect.
But it's the universality that there is this phenomenon that we call life, and it can operate with different substrate, different building blocks. Now, it may be that 99% of life in the universe that happens spontaneously comes from carbon chemistry, because that is so ubiquitous and we kind of see how that could work. But maybe there's 1% out there, if this universality of the phenomenon of life holds, maybe there's 1% out there, and that could be billions of worlds across the observable universe, that is radically different in terms of the substrate.
It's a great moment to go into this slide, which is again, a real astronomical portrait of all the galaxies we've observed with this, what's called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, and there's, again, hundreds of billions of galaxies, and that's only our observable universe. So right before we open it up to questions from people, I know we're running a little late, I just want to emphasize that that's just the part we can see. That's just the part where light has traveled to us. So what if the universe is technically infinitely big? And beyond that distance, there are more galaxies and more galaxies and more galaxies. Doesn't that mean, if we're going to discuss probabilities, which I know, Caleb, you like to do, I've just learned tonight, that somewhere else in this infinite universe there's another planet infinitesimally similar to the Earth, and on it is life, and somewhere they're having a psychon conversation on the stage, but the guy's wearing a green shirt and has a star-nosed mole face. I don't know, just, some difference. And then there's an infinite number of those. Then there's an infinite number of those. So in some sense, if we open up to the infinity of the universe, or even the multiverse, other universes, aren't we guaranteed that there's other life very much like us?
Wow. Yeah. So, so this is, I think it's a good question. If, okay, there's a lot of ifs and buts there, right? Multiverse and woo. But it does speak to something. It does.
We don't care. We don't care who's credited with doing that.
So it allows me to use a word that I've been longing to use all evening, and that is fecundity. I would like to know the fecundity of the universe. And that kind of is, that's a...
You can get sued for stuff like that. Yeah.
I'm hoping people, if you don't know what it is, look it up, right? it's the fertility of the universe. So there is this interesting question, if, but the edge of the observable universe is a very long way away from us now, because we've had 13.8 billion years for the light to be traveling towards us. And we don't, for just our universe, we don't actually know how much further it goes, right? And it could be big enough that it is effectively infinite. And maybe there are entirely separated universes that have slightly different laws of physics and so on. The fascinating thing to me would be if we could really understand life and its origins in whatever ways, whatever substrates, whether it's organic chemistry or software or whatever. There's this notion of evaluating the fecundity of the universe, the observable universe, just how much life there is. And then, what would that tell us? That would be an interesting number, because it's going to be a finite number for the observable universe. And then you have to ask, are there better universes? And I love saying this as well. Are we in the wrong universe?
The grass is always greener on the other universe or something
exactly.
like that. Nick, you have a response?
Well, my feeling, I don't know much about multiverses, but my feeling is that
just pretend they exist.
Cosmological constants in this particular one are particularly well tuned to having stars and having planets and having life and so on and so on. So maybe the rest of the universes would be all much, much worse than this one. But, we look at this, we think about all these stars going 30.4 billion light years away, or whatever the distance is, and everything we can see, to me, as a non-physicist, and they're all stars. They're all a bit the same. They're all made of the same stuff. And so why would we think that life, therefore, should be inconceivably different? Maybe life on all of those other planets is just made of the same stuff, just like the stars are made of the same stuff. That would be my gut feeling. It might be disappointing to me, growing up on Star Wars and movies like that. You want there to be interesting, intelligent aliens out there, but I think everything that my science says is that it's not going to be that way.
But I have a feeling what you mean by same is, some DNA oriented, some carbon, respiration, sexual reproduction. You don't actually mean eyes. Or,
yes, I would actually mean eyes.
But it could evolve around a dark planet, or like the planet.
Yes,
I'm sorry,
but I would expect that eyes would arise many, many times, because the universe is full of light.
But
and eyes have arisen independently on Earth at least 70 or 80 different occasions.
But they might not see in the visible.
Oh, well, possibly not. Yeah. There's nothing.
They'll be like infrared eyes.
Possibly.
Like that.
I mean, there are infrared eyes on Earth as well. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of inventive biology, and this idea that we have a sample size of one. Actually, we have a sample size of millions upon billions of individual species, of populations of millions upon millions within those species. Life on Earth has explored almost everything that's possible on Earth. And if conditions are constrained down similar paths on other planets by very basic things, by things like gravity, by a requirement for carbon and water and so on, then it wouldn't be very surprising to me to find that life is not particularly dissimilar and liable to get stuck in a kind of an Earth-like rut, in the sense that it's pretty rare, even when you've got a planet full of complicated living organisms, for a species like us to arise.
That's a nice place, I think, to open it up for questions, almost as though, the multiverse is a form of natural selection. Universes try to be born, they fail. They try to be born, they fail, and only the ones in which the circumstances allow the emergence of life. Are there people there to ask the question? Can we open this? I think we have mics going around. If there are some, I wasn't quite ready to take my guess, but I'd love to take questions if people have. Is there somebody with a mic running around? Oh, hi, Rihanna, thanks. Okay, I guess somebody in the back has the mic, and then we'll bring some up front if we could.
Should I?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I just have a question about scale. I think you mentioned that the size of a cell is like, I would assume something around 10 to the minus 6 meters, maybe smaller.
Smaller, yeah.
But if you look at the observable scale of the universe, it's something 10 to the 26. And the Planck length is 10 to the minus 35 or so. So the dimension of a cell is really quite in the middle. That could be a beautiful coincidence, just as the coincidence that when we observe the moon and the sun, they seem to be the same size, but it's really just a coincidence of distance and scale. So I wondered, do you consider that a coincidence?
Nick?
I mean, there have been interesting questions about the possible bacteria found on a meteorite from Mars, which are nano-sized, and there was quite a discussion about, well, could they be alive, or are they too small to contain all the necessary parts for a living cell? And since we don't know what the necessary parts for a living cell are, we don't really know. But at a broader level, if you are constrained by it being carbon-based, and if you are constrained by a degree of complexity, and then spontaneously forming structures, membranes form spontaneously as layers which are about 6 nanometers thick, so that's 10 to the minus 9 of a meter. So I think that the scale is that way for chemical reasons, really. The smallest cells are probably substantially, down at virus size, but it would be hard to imagine that you'd get much smaller than a virus and be still alive.
Yeah, because I mean, life kind of does what it needs to, but no more, right? It's sort of efficient in that sense. And of course, this midway point is only if you're thinking logarithmically, right? So you're doing that transformation in your head, which is fine, because
We like base 10 systems, but they're not really. It's just what we like.
Right.
Was there another question? Did I cut you off, Caleb?
Yeah.
Or okay, please, yes.
Each of you have touched on the limit of human cognition. How much do you think about it, and can you leverage it?
Leverage the limitations of human cognition? Was that the question?
I just helped start a new institute in New York that's going to try to do some of that, called Y House. Quick shout out to that. Yeah, I'm not quite, I mean, leverage in what sense?
Isn't it part of cognition itself that consciousness has to do with self-reflection, and that means that you have to consider that there are limits of your cognition, and you have touched on it a number of times in this discussion.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed that we can know as much as we do know, actually. I think it's fantastic. It's wonderful to be alive at this time where I would have said it's impossible that we could know this stuff, but we do. Now, there's an awful lot we don't know, but I'm not sure that's because it's at the limits of human cognition. It's because we just don't know. And I think, a lot of the questions about just how probable is the origin of life on a particular type of planet, I think we'll know that. That boils down to questions like, well, to what extent does self-organization of matter can give rise to a structure as complicated as a kind of protein machine, like a ribosome that builds proteins? Just how far does that go? There's hardly been any really serious work on that yet. So these are questions that we can cognitively understand. We just don't know the answers to them yet.
I'm sorry, I think we're just going to take one more question because we are running late. So lucky person nearest the microphone. But please feel welcome. We're going to have a book signing afterwards. We've got a telescope, which may or may not be up on the container. I think we have good viewing. And we have a microscope, which is showing some stuff. So feel welcome to stay afterwards, please.
So you mentioned that multicellular life you think only formed once or maybe twice. But is that because it didn't actually form, or is it just less successful than what survived?
Well, multicellular life arose on actually 30 or 40 separate occasions. So that seems to be easy. It's the complex cell that underpins basically all multicellular life. But there are some bacteria that form very simple multicellular structures. And you mentioned, it's just bacteria or something at some point. Why can't we have bacterial humans? Why can't we have complex animals made from very 100%. Simple cells? But we that doesn't happen on Earth, but it's perfectly conceivable.
Like a superorganism made out of a collective of bacteria. In the same way that an ant colony is like a superorganism.
But we see no sign of that in bacteria. Perhaps it exists and we simply haven't understood that. But I haven't seen a sign of it.
Caleb?
Sorry, what was the question?
Actually,
no,
no,
I was just thinking.
Don't do that.
Well, my understanding of, there is evidence. Well, we know that bacteria sense their environment and sense the presence of other organisms, and there is evidence of, I think, some of these soil bacteria that actually grow little metallic connectors. But is that for communication or is it for energy transport?
Energy mostly.
Okay.
So right before we leave, I just want to give each of you a chance to do you have a closing thought for the audience that you would like them to walk away with?
Yeah. Go on. Okay, well, so this is going off, but it actually comes off of the question about cognition. So, there are all these marvelous, wonderful mysteries in the universe, including the origins of life, which great progress has been made on in terms of the origin of life on the Earth. And we are making progress on looking for life elsewhere. But something I come back to, and recently I've been coming back to again and again, is this pretty deep question about the fundamental nature of the universe. Here's the universe. Okay, so let me give you an anecdote as an example, or an analogy. If I put a glass of water in front of you and say, in 4 billion years' time, that will become sentient. It will become self-aware, capable of having this conversation like we're having.
No, it won't.
You go, it's complete nonsense. Yes. But that is what the universe has done. 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was boring. It was hot, dense, and uniform. Somehow, over 13 billion years, it has got to the point where it has created structures out of itself capable of being aware of the fact that they live in that universe. What the hell does that mean?
Nice. Nick?
I've really got nothing to compete with that, though. This is going to be very banal, actually, but what I tried to do in my book was to say, well, why is life the way that it is here on Earth? So it's not just at the level of carbon base, but why does it do its energy generation in this particular way? Is there a good reason for that? And if there is a good reason for it, what's the probability of it being that way everywhere else? And if it's that way everywhere else, would we run into the same problem with this kind of stickiness at the origin of complex cells and so on? How much can we... I think one of the great things about astrobiology is it turns biologists like me back on ourselves to say, well, hang on a minute, we've got to somehow try to understand what are the possibilities of life being different ways elsewhere. And to do that, I think you first have to understand why life is this way here. And as soon as you start to think along those lines, I think we begin to ask questions of biology that's not just about information, it's not just about DNA, because that's actually almost the opposite of any form of constraint. As soon as you're onto information, then anything is possible. But the constraints are physical constraints of cell structures and things like that. An ambition, I suppose what I tried to do in the book is to lay out the principles for why life might be this way here, and then extrapolate that into the universe to try and work out, well, would it be that way anywhere else?
And how close do you think we are to an answer? Just one word. 100 years, you can have more than one word. 100 years, 1,000 years, millennia. Who knows?
I think within the next 100 years we will have a pretty good idea of why life is this way. I think we almost do. It's just we have good ideas now. I just don't think that we know what the correct answer is.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, the optimism of scientists. But I agree with you. I share the same optimism. Please come and speak to the guests. They'll be signing books. And I also want to emphasize, I know many of you had questions and we didn't get to them, so feel free to tweet us or whatever. And over the next couple of days, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can before we become exhausted. But let's thank our guests very much for coming.